The Senate has overwhelmingly voted to expand the NATO alliance to include Montenegro. 97 senators voted for the measure yesterday, many casting the vote as a symbolic rebuke to Russia, whose government is opposed to the Cold War-era military organization expanding eastward towards its borders. Worth noting, the Senate's enthusiasm is not entirely shared in Montenegro, where a poll conducted by the Center for Democracy and Human Rights as recently as December showed a slight majority of the country against NATO membership. Senators Mike Lee and Rand Paul, the only two to vote against expansion, questioned the logic of the move.
I don't see how the accession of Montenegro, a country with a population smaller than most congressional districts, and a military smaller than the police force of the District of Columbia, is beneficial enough that we should share an agreement for collective defense.
The Senate hearing on admitting Montenegro to NATO was really just a punching session about Russia. Not one word was said about allowing Montenegro into NATO or how it would advance our own national security. We were going to send a message to Russia. Even the citizens of Montenegro are divided on this. About half of them want to be in NATO, and the other half don't want to be in NATO. But it isn't really about them. It's about us. Is admitting Montenegro to NATO good for us?
Let's bring in Daniel McAdams, Executive Director of the Ron Paul Institute. Daniel, what threat can you see Montenegro supposedly facing, which would require it to join NATO?
Well, there was that crazy idea that somehow Russia had a plan to attack the parliament of Montenegro dressed as a Cossack folk band. I don't know if you heard that one. There were all kinds of crazy things that were, all kinds of crazy things brought forth. But you know, this has nothing to do with NATO's, with Montenegro's security. Has nothing to do with the U.S. security. Senators Paul and Lee were absolutely right. This is completely about Russia. This is to create momentum to continue the encircling of Russia with NATO members. Next up is going to be Georgia and then Ukraine. The Montenegro accession is really to create that momentum. All about Russia, certainly not about the United States, not about our security.
And we haven't heard much from Donald Trump on this, who ran a campaign at least critical of NATO. Some characterized it as against NATO or anti-NATO, but he was more critical of NATO. This move is something that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson asked for. What does this all say about where the Trump administration might be going in Europe?
Well, I have a weird feeling that someone kidnapped the candidate Donald Trump and replaced him with a robot who's now President Trump, because he's taken the opposite of every position that he's taken during the campaign. Where is President Trump? Where is candidate Trump on this? He said that NATO is outdated. He said repeatedly, even as president, that member countries of NATO must pool their fair share, pay their own freight. I'm sorry, Montenegro is a relatively impoverished country. They have no capacity to pay even their own freight. They're going to be a net drain. So President Trump, where are you?
Well, Montenegro was part of the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia until its dissolution and only gained official independence in 2006. Give our viewers some historical context to that cluster of countries when it comes to NATO. I believe NATO actually bombed Montenegro back during the war.
That is indeed true, and it was sadly we've passed the anniversary of that terrible event in 1999 just recently. I guess it's some sort of perverse Stockholm syndrome now, but the reality is people like Milo Djukanovic, who was elected in 97. In fact, I was there for the election as an observer. He's known as Mr. 10% because of his notorious reputation for corruption. He has been a U.S. puppet. The U.S. has turned a blind eye to his corruption this entire time. So essentially what you've done in Montenegro is rig elections, make sure pro-U.S. candidates are elected, and make sure the country stays in our orbit. And that's where we get to where we are today. As you pointed out, the people don't want to be in NATO. They have very strong memories still of being bombed by NATO.
Well, despite its size, Montenegro is also geographically significant, as RT web writer Nebojsa Malik pointed out last year. With it, quote, NATO will have full control of the Adriatic Sea, that's the coast, finish the encirclement of Serbia, and be emboldened to pursue a more aggressive stance toward Russia. I mean, what's the end game here? Who benefits from a more aggressive stance towards Russia?
Well, I would say the military-industrial complex in the United States and to a lesser degree in Europe benefit from this. They're always looking for new targets. I don't think they actually want war, but they want us to get us as close as humanly possible. The problem is if they miscalculate or make a mistake, the consequences are very high for the rest of us. And of course, that will mean many more naval operations in the Adriatic, joint military operations, more provocations toward Russia. It does us not one bit of good whatsoever.
The Socialist Party in Montenegro, which is not in power, is calling for a referendum to be held so citizens in Montenegro can determine their relationship with NATO. As we've mentioned, polling shows it's not a move the public clearly supports. So why are leaders in countries like Montenegro so keen to join NATO if there's no real threat to their security or overwhelming popular support?
Because the elites in these countries are notoriously corrupt, and NATO will provide them with access to large Western corporations who will set up partnerships where they will be able to skim some off the top as they've always done. These are the elites, and they'll remain the elites. There'll be lots of plum jobs in Brussels. Who wants to stay in Podgorica when you can go in Brussels and enjoy being considered an elite? There are plenty of perks for the people who run these places, and they will do their best to keep anyone else out, including a referendum.
We have about a minute left. When Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, was here a few weeks ago, Donald Trump made NATO an issue, and she actually said that Germany will contribute more to NATO, or at least set a goal to do that. That sounds like NATO actually expanding or getting more money as a result of Trump's criticism. I don't know what your take on that all is.
Well, I think it's very funny if these countries, if Poland, if Germany, if they feel so threatened by Russia, why does the U.S. have to come to them practically with a gun in its hand, asking them to pay more for their own defense? You know, if you felt threatened by your neighbor, you wouldn't have to have some guy down the street convincing you to lock your doors. You know, it's absolutely absurd. It just says that this is part of the neocon move to encircle and threaten Russia, not the other way around.
Daniel McAdams with the Ron Paul Institute. Always a great conversation with you. Thanks so much.